Hello, this is Yarrow. Welcome to today's episode of the Yarrow podcast. So, I've been doing quite a bit of research on companies, in particular for deep dive podcast scripts. I'm not going to talk about why I'm doing that just yet, but it's been a lot of fun for me because I'm hearing the full story archive of some companies. And it's really interesting to notice how for a lot of the, we're talking very large companies here, like Disney and Marvel and Lucasfilm. There's obviously a connection between all of those three. And some other ones I've been looking at, like Nestle and Crocs and Rode and Canva and Sephora. I've done a lot in the last few months just looking at these different companies for a little side project. And it's so interesting because often these companies have some sort of combination of skill sets in the leadership. It could be the two co-founders. Later on, it could be the CEO and some sort of COO. And more often than not, there's an interesting combination between a creative role and an operational role. The creative role might be visionary. If you're in the case of Disney, it's the actual making cartoons, making movies, making something creative. And when I say that, that's Walt Disney. And then it was brother Roy was doing more of the finances, the bookkeeping, making sure the money was there to fund all these dreams and ambitions that his brother had. And then with Disney later on, there was combinations where it worked really well when you had like a more visionary leader like Iger. And then there was some kind of operational person or even like an emotional counterpart to that. Like Iger was quite abrasive and pushy and aggressive, but it was balanced against his basically COO, Frank, who was more, methodical, emotionally stable. But then Frank died and things went crazy because that counterbalance wasn't there. And it's interesting to hear so many of these stories, especially with co-founders, even like the Canva story. It seems like, Melanie Perkins was very visionary, big picture, and her husband was a bit more day-to-day operations. And then they had an engineering, tech sort of focused co-founder as well. So it's these kind of combinations at the top that I find really fascinating. And I actually reflect back on my own career. The biggest successes I've actually had, two in particular. I mean, there's one that I did mostly by myself, my education company, but there was an element in that education company that I don't talk about as much, but I did used to talk about a lot because I had a co-founder for my first ever video project, my good friend Gideon Shalwick down in Australia. And when we came together, there was an element there of combining two things that, we didn't have individually. Gideon had this passion and this desire to explore video when it was a fairly new format on the internet. And I had an audience and I had, people paying attention to whatever I was writing so I could promote something. So when we met and then came together to create essentially the first ever how to make money with blogs in a video course, I'm pretty certain we were the first people to do that. There weren't any other video courses on that topic. Blogging was still quite new. So we came together and we had this combined outfit where he created the course. He was definitely the creative person for this project because, the videos were his creation. I certainly helped guide structure and what to teach because I was the one who had a blog. But he put together the visuals, the voice, the medium, and I promoted it, used my email list, my blog, my podcast to sell this course. And we did really well. That course, I don't have the actual numbers, but I know we sold somewhere around almost $1 million US over the course of that course being sold over a couple of years, several years, which is tied or pretty close to the same numbers I did with my own flagship course, Blog Mastermind, which was originally a text course. That's why we switched to a video version later on. Obviously, video is pretty standard nowadays, but that was the early days. And then more recently with my current agency, my co-founder Claire and I came together in a classic operations and marketing combination. So Claire was just fantastic at operations. She became an amazing team builder and team leader and has run just the operations side of our company. She's great at managing our clients, managing our team, and built a real machine there. And I've been in the marketing role, which by definition is just more creative because you do have to deal with the variables of, how to reach people using different formats of media, even the fact that you're creating content, whether it's ad content, content for social media, content for search engines, all of that is basically a creative output. So there's an element of creativity and marketing as a social science is obviously quite creative as well. You're trying to understand, human psychology and come up with new ideas to grab attention and deliver a message. So that combination has worked really well for us because we've been able to basically silo ourselves into these two different functions and not have to really worry too much about the other person's role. Now, we do cross over. We do talk about situations. Since her team does the hiring when I want to expand my team, usually they're the ones who are, trying to source talent for things. But it, as a general rule, the company has operated fairly separately in the sense that, I go and get a client and pass it on over to the operations side, which then just delivers. So that's been really successful. And I think there's something about that combination of, whatever, it doesn't always have to be operations and creativity, but there usually is something similar to that. There's some element of a logical, more structured process building brain, and then a more creative, trying to, dream up something or make something come into existence. So I say this knowing that it's not always possible, but if you are a person who, you know your strengths and you're thinking about doing a certain type of business, this might be something you do need to factor in. Maybe you do need a co-founder, or maybe you need to hire a senior person in your team to do that function that you're not good at. So if you're great at operations, but maybe not great at marketing and creativity, bring on someone to do that. Other way around, if you're, great at building audiences and marketing, but you really suck at building teams and, creating systems and operations, I would suggest you first come and hire one of our team members at 50 hours, 50hrs.com. We can bring you a nice team of executive assistants to take over operations and build systems for you. But maybe you also need a senior leader person in that role to help out as well. It's a simple hack, but yet it's also quite difficult because you're ultimately choosing to either partner with someone, which is like a marriage, or hire someone who's quite senior, who you'll be working with a lot. And that's an important role that you can't just sort of easily find just, whoever's around. So it is a critical decision, I believe, for any business. Who you work with for these core activities, it really defines. It's a make or break situation. Certainly in my experience, I've probably had, I'd say, more failures because I've lacked one of the other things. The things that have worked the best have always had those two elements met. Doesn't have to be a co-founder, but there's almost always some kind of function. Now, bearing in mind, some kind of function that, does creativity, does operations. Bearing in mind, though, business model matters a lot here too. What you're selling, how you're selling it. Certain businesses don't need a lot of people, so maybe you can manage a small team. If you're just a person with a podcast or a YouTube channel or a newsletter, you can probably get away with just being creative, having a few people around you. That's what I had for quite a long time with my education business. Despite the partnership with Gideon, for most of the time in that business, I was the solo owner and I was the creator, and I could get away with basically creating product, creating marketing, and having a small team helping me do that. But that business model lends itself well. I could not do that with an agency because there's so much team building required to make an agency work. Of course, on the plus side, delivery happens without me now for an agency. I don't worry about what's going on with the meeting the needs of our clients. That is handled by Claire and the operations team. Okay, I'll end it there. Thank you for listening to the Yarrow podcast. Food for thought. I always think about, these key roles, key responsibilities, key talents, whether you're maybe suffering because you're lacking in some of these areas. That could be stunting your growth. I am available as a coach to talk through this for your own situation, your own business. You can go to insidegrowth.com and book a call with me. Happy to talk to you just in a free introductory call. Tell me where you're at, what you're struggling with, what your goals are. And we can look at how to get you to the next level. And maybe you do need to bring on some certain key team members to solve these problems so that'll unlock growth, remove that blockage, and get you moving forward. Again, that's insidegrowth.com. Thanks for listening today. My name is Yarrow. I'll speak to you soon. Bye-bye.